The morning mist still clung to the valleys surrounding Cedar Creek when 12-year-old Matthew Sullivan watched helplessly as 3 men on horseback set fire to the small cabin that held every memory he had of his deceased father. The boy pressed himself behind a large pine tree, tears streaming down his dirt-stained face as the flames consumed the handmade furniture his father had crafted with love, the books they had read together by lamplight, and the photograph of his mother that had sat on the mantelpiece like a shrine to better times. Matthew's father, Thomas Sullivan, had died of consumption 3 months earlier, leaving the boy alone with nothing but the small cabin and 40 acres of rocky land that barely produced enough to keep them fed. The property wasn't valuable by most standards, but it represented everything Matthew had left of his family, and he had been struggling to maintain it while working odd jobs in town to earn enough for basic survival. The 3 men who had come to destroy his home were Jake Morrison, his brother Pete Morrison, and their cousin Earl Blackwood, all of whom worked for the largest ranch in the territory and had apparently decided that Matthew's small homestead was an obstacle to their employers' expansion plans. They had arrived at dawn with torches and coal oil, clearly intending to drive the orphaned boy from his land through intimidation and destruction. "Look at that shack burn," Jake Morrison called out with obvious satisfaction, his voice carrying clearly across the small valley as he watched the flames consume the modest structure that had been Matthew's entire world. "Should have taken our boss's offer when you had the chance, boy. Now you got nothing left but the clothes on your back." Pete Morrison's laughter was even crueler than his brother's words, the sound echoing off the surrounding hills like the cawing of carrion birds celebrating another creature's misfortune. "Maybe now the little orphan will understand that he don't belong in this valley with decent folks who got real business to conduct." Earl Blackwood, the youngest of the 3 but perhaps the most vicious, dismounted from his horse and picked up rocks to throw at the burning cabin, whooping with delight each time his missiles crashed through windows that had once framed Matthew's view of the mountains where his father had taught him to hunt and fish. "This is what happens to people who don't know their place," Earl shouted, his voice filled with the kind of mindless cruelty that characterized men who had never faced real consequences for their actions. "Orphan brats got no business trying to hold on to property that could be put to better use by their betters." Matthew crouched behind his tree, his small body shaking with grief and rage as he watched everything his father had built reduced to ash and smoke. The boy understood that. He was witnessing more than just the destruction of a building. He was seeing his childhood, his security, and his connection to his parents' memory being deliberately obliterated by men who viewed his suffering as entertainment. As the flames reached their peak and the cabin's roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning timber, the 3 arsonists mounted their horses and prepared to ride away, their work of destruction complete and their cruel laughter still echoing across the valley. "That'll teach any other squatters who think they can stand in the way of progress," Jake Morrison called out as they spurred their horses toward the main road. "Come on, boys, let's get back to town and tell the boss that his expansion problems just got solved permanent-like." Matthew remained hidden until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely, then emerged from his hiding place to stand before the smoldering ruins of his home. The heat from the dying flames warmed his face, but the warmth felt like mockery given the coldness that had settled in his heart as he contemplated his complete loss and utter helplessness. The boy walked slowly through the ashes, searching for anything that might have survived the deliberate destruction, but the Morrison brothers had done their work thoroughly. Every photograph, every book, every piece of furniture that might have provided comfort or connection to happier times had been reduced to charcoal and smoke. It was while Matthew knelt in the ashes, holding the twisted remains of his mother's silver locket, that he heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Fear shot through him like lightning as he wondered if the arsonists had returned to finish what they had started. perhaps deciding that leaving witnesses alive was poor planning on their part. But the figure who emerged from the morning mist was nothing like the cruel men who had destroyed Matthew's home. The rider was tall and lean, with grey hair beneath a black hat, and eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the scene with the kind of professional assessment that suggested experience with violence and its aftermath. Gabriel Stone was a bounty hunter whose reputation extended throughout 5 territories, a man whose skill at tracking criminals had made him wealthy, while his sense of justice had made him selective about which bounties he chose to pursue. At 53 years old, Gabriel had seen enough of human cruelty to recognize it immediately, and the scene before him told a story that made his weathered hands clench involuntarily around his horse's reins. "Son," Gabriel said gently as he dismounted and approached the boy who knelt amid the ruins. "Looks like you've had some trouble here. Are you hurt?" Matthew looked up at the stranger with eyes that held more pain than any 12-year-old should have to carry, and his voice shook as he tried to explain what had happened to his home and his hopes for the future. "They burned it all, mister," Matthew said quietly, his words barely audible above the crackling of the dying flames. "3 men came this morning and burned down everything my pa built, everything I had left of my family." Gabriel's expression darkened as he studied the scene, his experienced eye taking in details that confirmed the deliberate nature of the destruction. The placement of the flames, the thoroughness of the damage, and the boy's obvious terror all pointed to arson committed by people who had wanted to send a message as well as destroy property. "Do you know who did this?" Gabriel asked, his voice carrying the kind of controlled intensity that suggested the answer would determine what happened next. Matthew nodded, wiping tears from his eyes as he struggled to control his emotions enough to provide the information that might lead to justice for this terrible crime. "Jake Morrison, Pete Morrison, and Earl Blackwood," Matthew said, his voice growing stronger as he named his tormentors. "They work for Mr. Garrison's ranch, and they said I didn't belong here because I'm just an orphan with no rights to hold on to land that better folks could use." Gabriel felt familiar anger building in his chest as he processed the boy's account, recognizing the pattern of powerful men using violence and intimidation to steal from those who couldn't fight back. It was the kind of injustice that had driven him to become a bounty hunter in the first place, and the sight of a child's suffering awakened protective instincts that had been shaped by his own difficult childhood. "Matthew," Gabriel said firmly, using the boy's name with the respect that adults should show to children regardless of their circumstances, "I want you to know that what happened here wasn't your fault, and it wasn't justice. It was just cruelty, and cruelty should always have consequences." The boy looked up at Gabriel with something that might have been hope beginning to kindle in his eyes, sensing that this stranger might be different from the adults who had dismissed his suffering as unimportant. "Are you a lawman, mister?" Matthew asked quietly, his voice showing the desperate need for someone with authority to care about what had happened to him. "I'm Gabriel Stone," the bounty hunter replied, his name carrying weight throughout the territories as someone who specialized in bringing dangerous criminals to justice. "And while I'm not exactly a lawman, I do have legal authority to apprehend people who commit serious crimes." Gabriel studied the ruins of the cabin, his professional mind already working on the problem of how to track down and capture the 3 men responsible for this act of arson and intimidation. "Matthew," Gabriel said decisively, "I'm going to make you a promise. Those 3 men are going to face justice for what they did here, and you're going to have a safe place to live while we make sure they can never hurt you again." The promise of protection and justice was more than Matthew had dared to hope for since watching his home burn, and for the first time in hours he felt something other than despair and helplessness. "What can I do to help?" Matthew asked, his voice showing the courage that had helped him survive as an orphan in a world that seemed designed to crush the weak and defenseless. Gabriel smiled at the boy's determination to participate in seeking justice rather than simply accepting charity, recognizing the strength of character that would serve Matthew well in whatever future he chose to build. "You can help by telling me everything you know about those 3 men and their habits," Gabriel said. "The more information I have, the easier it will be to track them down and make sure they face the consequences of their actions." 3 days had passed since the burning of Matthew Sullivan's cabin, and Gabriel Stone had spent those days gathering information about Jake Morrison, Pete Morrison, and Earl Blackwood, with the methodical precision that had made him one of the most successful bounty hunters in the Western Territories. The trail of evidence he had assembled painted a clear picture of 3 men whose pattern of intimidation and violence had been escalating for months without any meaningful intervention from local law enforcement. Matthew had proven to be an invaluable source of information about the 3 arsonists, his young mind having retained crucial details about their habits, their associations, and their connection to Garrison's ranch that would make tracking them significantly easier. The boy had also shown remarkable resilience during their time together, adapting to life on the trail with Gabriel and demonstrating the kind of practical intelligence that suggested he would thrive once his immediate crisis was resolved. "Mr. Stone," Matthew said as they made camp on a ridge overlooking the town of Cedar Creek, "I've been thinking about what you told me about justice versus revenge, and I want you to know that I don't want those men hurt just because they hurt me." Gabriel looked up from the coffee he was preparing over their small campfire, impressed by the moral maturity that Matthew was displaying despite his youth and the terrible experiences he had endured. "What do you want then?" Gabriel asked gently, recognizing that the boy's answer would reveal important things about his character and his understanding of right and wrong. "I want them to face the law like any other criminals would," Matthew replied thoughtfully, his voice showing the kind of careful consideration that suggested he had been wrestling with difficult questions about justice and forgiveness. "I want them arrested and tried in court, so other people will know that burning down orphan boys' homes isn't something they can get away with." The boy's desire for legal justice rather than personal revenge confirmed Gabriel's growing respect for Matthew's character and reinforced his determination to handle this case according to proper procedures rather than the rough frontier justice that some bounty hunters preferred. Gabriel had spent the previous day in town, quietly gathering information about the 3 men from bartenders, shopkeepers, and other citizens who had observed their behavior over the months leading up to the arson. What he had learned confirmed that Jake Morrison, Pete Morrison, and Earl Blackwood had been escalating their pattern of intimidation against small landowners, always acting under the implied protection of their employers' wealth and influence. "According to the folks in town," Gabriel told Matthew as they shared their simple meal, "those 3 men have been terrorizing anyone who wouldn't sell their land to Garrison's ranch. You weren't their first victim, just their most recent one." The revelation that other families had suffered similar treatment made Matthew's eyes flash with anger, but also with determination to ensure that the pattern of abuse was finally broken. "Are there warrants out for them?" Matthew asked, his practical mind focusing on the legal aspects of Gabriel's pursuit. "There are now," Gabriel replied with satisfaction. "I filed formal charges with Judge Patterson this morning, including arson, destruction of property, intimidation, and conspiracy. The judge issued arrest warrants immediately once he heard the evidence." The existence of legal warrants meant that Gabriel's capture of the 3 men would be entirely legitimate, with no questions about his authority or methods, as long as he followed proper procedures for apprehending fugitives. Gabriel's investigation had revealed that the Morrison brothers and Earl Blackwood typically spent their evenings at Murphy's saloon, where they drank heavily and bragged about their exploits, while assuming that their employer's influence would protect them from any legal consequences. Their predictable habits would make capture significantly easier, though Gabriel was planning a careful approach that would minimize the risk of violence or collateral damage to innocent bystanders. "Matthew," Gabriel said seriously, "tomorrow morning, I'm going to arrest those 3 men, and I want you to understand that there might be some danger involved. They're not going to surrender peacefully, and they might try to fight or run." The boy nodded with the kind of mature understanding that his difficult experiences had forced upon him, but his response showed that he trusted Gabriel's ability to handle whatever challenges might arise. "I know you'll do what's right, Mr. Stone," Matthew said simply, "and I know you'll do it safely because you're too smart to take unnecessary risks." Gabriel felt his chest tighten with emotion at the boy's complete faith in his abilities and judgment, and he silently vowed that Matthew's trust would not be misplaced. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the grass and the kind of crisp air that made sounds carry further than usual. Gabriel had positioned himself across the street from Murphy's saloon, where his investigation had confirmed the 3 fugitives would be having their usual breakfast before starting another day of intimidating local residents. Matthew waited, with Gabriel's horse at a safe distance, his job being to hold the animals and stay out of harm's way while the actual arrests took place. The boy had argued for a more active role, but Gabriel had been firm about keeping him away from any situation that might involve gunplay or violence. At precisely 8 o'clock in the morning, Jake Morrison, Pete Morrison, and Earl Blackwood emerged from the saloon, their loud conversation and obvious hangovers making them easy targets for a bounty hunter who had been planning their capture for days. "Jake Morrison, Pete Morrison, Earl Blackwood," Gabriel called out clearly, his voice carrying easily across the empty street. "You're under arrest on charges of arson and intimidation. I'm a licensed bounty hunter with legal warrants for your apprehension." The 3 men stopped dead in their tracks, their alcohol-fogged brains struggling to process the unexpected challenge to their comfortable assumption that they were untouchable due to their employer's protection. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Jake Morrison snarled, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun despite his obvious intoxication. "We work for Mr. Garrison, and he don't take kindly to folks interfering with his business operations." "Your employer's protection doesn't extend to arson and intimidation," Gabriel replied calmly, his own hand resting casually near his weapon while his eyes tracked all 3 men for signs of aggressive movement. "You can surrender peacefully and face trial, or you can resist arrest and face the additional charges that come with assaulting a legal officer." Pete Morrison, apparently the least intelligent of the 3, made the mistake of actually drawing his gun, but Gabriel's response was so fast that the weapon was shot from Pete's hand before he could aim it properly. The sound of gunfire echoed through the town, drawing people from their morning activities to witness the arrest of 3 men who had terrorized the community for months. "Anyone else want to try resisting arrest?" Gabriel asked conversationally, his smoking gun still aimed at the 3 men who were now fully awake and aware of how dangerous their situation had become. Earl Blackwood, the youngest and perhaps the smartest of the 3, immediately raised, his hands in surrender, having no desire to test his speed against a bounty hunter whose reputation was legendary throughout the territory. "We surrender!" Earl called out, his voice cracking with fear as he realized that their comfortable immunity from consequences had finally come to an end. "Don't shoot us. We'll come quietly." Jake Morrison, however, seemed determined to compound his legal troubles by attempting to flee rather than surrender. He spun around and began running toward the horses tied behind the saloon, apparently believing that escape was still possible despite being outnumbered by a professional tracker in broad daylight. Gabriel's second shot was equally precise, striking. the ground directly in front of Jake's boots and sending up a spray of dust that stopped the fleeing man in his tracks. "Mr. Morrison," Gabriel called out with deadly calm, "the next shot won't be a warning. Turn around and walk back here with your hands visible, or discover what happens when fugitives resist arrest with violence." Jake Morrison's shoulders sagged with defeat as he realized that his attempt at escape had failed, and he slowly turned around and walked back to where Gabriel waited with shackles that would ensure all three men faced the legal consequences of their actions. Within 30 minutes, Jake Morrison, Pete Morrison, and Earl Blackwood were secured in the town jail, their arrests witnessed by dozens of citizens who had suffered under their reign of intimidation and were now seeing justice finally served. The trial of Jake Morrison, Pete Morrison, and Earl Blackwood took place 2 weeks after their arrest in the territorial courthouse where Judge Patterson presided over proceedings that had drawn spectators from throughout the region. The case had become something of a sensation, representing the first time that employees of the powerful Garrison Ranch had faced serious legal consequences for their pattern of intimidation and violence against small landowners. Matthew Sullivan sat in the front row of the courtroom, his testimony having been crucial in establishing the timeline and circumstances of the arson that had destroyed his family's cabin. The boy had proven to be an excellent witness, his clear memory and honest demeanor making him credible, despite his youth and his obvious emotional investment in the outcome of the trial. Gabriel Stone had also testified extensively about his investigation and the arrests he had made, his professional reputation and methodical evidence gathering having provided the prosecution with a solid foundation for their case against the three defendants. The bounty hunter's careful documentation of the crime scene and his interviews with witnesses had created an unshakable record of guilt that even the defendant's expensive attorney could not effectively challenge. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Prosecutor William Hayes said during his closing argument, "the evidence in this case is overwhelming and undisputed. These three men deliberately burned down a child's home, destroying everything he had left of his deceased parents, simply because they wanted his land for their employer's expansion." The prosecutor's words carried special weight because several members of the jury had themselves been approached by Garrison Ranch representatives about selling their property, and they understood that Matthew's victimization could easily have been their own if they had continued to refuse the ranch's increasingly aggressive offers. "The defense has argued that this was simply a business dispute that got out of hand," Hayes continued. "But burning down a child's home is not a business practice. It's a criminal act that demands the full punishment of the law." The defense attorney, Marcus Blackwell, had struggled throughout the trial to find arguments that might excuse or minimize his client's actions, but the evidence against them was simply too strong and too well documented to allow for reasonable doubt about their guilt. "Your Honor," Blackwell said during his own closing argument, "while my client's actions were regrettable, they were acting under orders from their employer and believed they were conducting legitimate business operations." Judge Patterson's response to this argument revealed his opinion of attempts to excuse criminal behavior based on employer authorization. "Mr. Blackwell," the judge said with obvious disapproval, "following illegal orders does not excuse criminal conduct, and burning down homes is illegal regardless of who authorizes such actions." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all charges against all three defendants. The speed of their decision reflected not just the strength of the evidence, but the community's determination to send a message that intimidation and violence would no longer be tolerated as acceptable business practices. Judge Patterson's sentencing was swift and severe, reflecting his understanding that the case represented an opportunity to establish important precedents about the rule of law in frontier communities. Jake Morrison, Pete Morrison, and Earl Blackwood, Judge Patterson announced formally, you have been found guilty of arson, destruction of property, intimidation, and conspiracy. I hereby sentence each of you to 5 years in territorial prison, with the possibility of parole after 3 years, contingent upon good behavior and full restitution to your victims. The harsh sentences drew gasps from the courtroom spectators, many of whom had expected lighter punishment for men whose employer possessed significant political influence in the territory. Furthermore, Judge Patterson continued, I am ordering each defendant to pay restitution in the amount of $500 to Matthew Sullivan to compensate him for the destruction of his family's property and to provide him with resources to rebuild his life. The restitution order was almost as shocking as the prison sentences, representing more money than most frontier families saw in years of hard work, and ensuring that Matthew would have genuine financial security for the first time since his father's death. As the 3 convicted arsonists were led away in shackles to begin their prison terms, Matthew felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring back his family's possessions or erase the trauma of watching his home burn while his tormentors laughed at his suffering. How do you feel about the verdict? Gabriel asked, as they walked out of the courthouse together, the bounty hunter having developed genuine affection for the boy during their weeks of working together to bring the criminals to justice. I feel like my parents would be proud, Matthew said thoughtfully, his voice showing the kind of mature reflection that his experiences had forced upon him. Not because their killers got punished, but because the law worked the way it's supposed. To work when good people stand up for what's right. Gabriel felt his throat tighten with emotion at the boy's wisdom and his ability to find meaning in justice rather than just satisfaction in revenge. What are your plans now? Gabriel asked, though he suspected he already knew what Matthew's answer would be. I want to rebuild my family's cabin, Matthew said with determination that impressed everyone who heard him. Not exactly the same, but better. A place where other orphan children might find safety if they need it, because I learned that having someone willing to stand up for you can make all the difference in the world. The boy's plan to use his painful experiences as motivation for helping others revealed the strength of character that had impressed Gabriel from their first meeting, and confirmed his belief that Matthew would build a meaningful life despite the terrible losses he had suffered. 6 months later, as Gabriel rode past the site where Matthew's family cabin had once stood, he could see the framework of a larger, more substantial house rising from the ashes of the old structure. Matthew was working alongside several adult volunteers, his energy and determination inspiring the entire community to contribute to his rebuilding effort. The sight of the boy who had lost everything working to create something better for himself and others was more satisfying to Gabriel than any bounty he had ever collected, and he felt pride in having played a role in ensuring that justice prevailed over cruelty in at least one corner of the harsh frontier world. They had burned the orphan boy's father's cabin and laughed at his suffering, but the bounty hunter had, indeed, ended their sunrise. Not with violence, but with the law working exactly as it was meant to work when applied with wisdom and determination. Justice had been served, the innocent had been protected, and the community had learned that even the most powerful people would be held accountable for their crimes against the defenseless. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to follow more incredible stories of justice, courage, and second chances from the Old West. Hit that subscribe button now and join our community of believers in doing what's right.